The Emberfield rest stop, a quiet oasis on a lonely stretch of highway, was about to become the stage for an unexpected drama. When David Harper, a battle-hardened Marine, stopped here for a quick coffee break, he had no idea he was stepping into a different kind of battlefield. As he observed a young black girl sitting across from an older white man, his finely tuned instincts told him that something was terribly wrong. But in a world where appearances can deceive, how could David be sure? What hidden danger was lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary scene? Let's find out. But before we dive in, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And if this suspenseful story captures your attention, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss out on more gripping tales like this one. Bookmark? The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet rural highway that cut through the rolling fields of Ember Grove. As the day faded into early evening, the warm colors of sunset bathed the landscape in hues of orange and pink, creating a calm yet slightly eerie atmosphere. It was along this lonely stretch of road that a small nondescript rest stop emerged, standing alone like a beacon for any weary traveler in need of a break. The rest stop itself was unimpressive, a basic structure with a diner and convenience store, flanked by an old, cracked parking lot where only a few cars were parked. The building was modest, painted in faded colors that hinted at its age. Inside the diner, the soft hum of fluorescent lights mixed with the faint sound of cutlery clinking against plates, a sound both familiar and oddly soothing. There was a sense of timelessness here, as if this little diner had been untouched by the passage of years, serving travelers who were here one moment and gone the next. Inside, a quiet murmur of conversation occasionally broke the silence. Plastic booths lined the walls, their faded vinyl upholstery evidence of countless customers who had sat there over the years. Near the entrance, a coffee station stood, half full and still steaming, ready to offer a bit of comfort to anyone in need of caffeine. A row of vending machines buzzed softly in the corner, adding to the subtle background noise that made up the ambiance of this otherwise silent place. The door swung open with a soft creak, and a gust of cool evening air swept in, drawing the attention of the few patrons inside. Standing in the doorway was a man in his late 30s, wearing a dark green jacket with a military insignia embroidered on one sleeve. His name was David Harper, a former Marine with a gaze that hinted at years of experience in observing his surroundings and reading people. Despite being back on American soil for months, the instincts that had kept him alive on foreign battlegrounds hadn't left him. He moved with practiced caution, his eyes scanning the room before he took a step inside. David's gaze swept over the diner's sparse crowd, a couple of truckers huddled over their steaming mugs of coffee, an elderly woman nibbling on a piece of pie, and a middle-aged man in a crisp, navy blue suit reading a newspaper. It was a typical scene, and yet something about it made David uneasy, though he couldn't quite place why just yet. Then his attention was drawn to a small figure seated in a yellow booth by the window. It was a young girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, with dark skin and big, expressive eyes that darted around the room as if searching for something. She wore a bright red dress that made her stand out against the muted tones of the diner's interior, and her curly hair framed a face that seemed both innocent and deeply troubled. The girl was sitting across from the man in the suit, and the stark contrast between them, their ages and their appearances, instantly caught David's attention. The man with her, whom we'll call Mark Smith, appeared to be in his early 50s. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his suit was impeccably tailored, giving him an air of control and authority. He held his newspaper up, blocking his face from the girl, yet David noticed how Mark's eyes would occasionally peer over the top of the paper, watching the child with an intensity that seemed off. There was something in that gaze that didn't sit right with David. As David made his way to the counter to order a coffee, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man and the girl were an unusual pair, to say the least, and the stark difference between them in both age and race raised questions in David's mind. It could be innocent, he reasoned. Perhaps she was his adopted daughter, or maybe he was a family friend. But it was the girl's demeanor that unsettled him. She seemed tense, her small hands fidgeting in her lap, her gaze shifting nervously from one corner of the diner to the other, as if she were afraid to let her eyes rest on any one spot for too long. Shaking off his unease, David reminded himself that he was here for a quick break, a chance to rest and recharge before continuing his long drive. He had spent the day traveling across state lines, hoping to reach his final destination by morning, and this small, roadside diner seemed like the perfect place to grab a cup of coffee and relax. But as he waited for his coffee, his gaze drifted back to the unusual pair by the window. The girl's eyes met his briefly, and in that fleeting moment, David felt a chill run down his spine. There was a depth of emotion in those young eyes, a kind of desperation that no child should have to endure. It was something beyond mere shyness or discomfort. As the waitress handed him his steaming cup of coffee, David made a quick decision. Instead of taking a seat at the counter, he chose a spot near the vending machines, a position that gave him a clear view of the entire diner without drawing too much attention to himself. He leaned casually against the wall, sipping his coffee slowly as he observed the pair, his mind now fully alert to even the smallest of details. The girl's fingers tapped a silent rhythm on the tabletop, her feet swinging back and forth beneath her seat, unable to reach the floor. Every so often she would glance up at Mark, quickly averting her gaze whenever she found him watching her. Mark, for his part, maintained an air of calm detachment, his eyes moving between his newspaper and the child with a controlled indifference that seemed almost rehearsed. David's instincts, honed by years of military service, were kicking in. Every fiber of his being told him that something about this situation wasn't right. But what could he do? He was no longer in a combat zone. This was just a diner off a quiet stretch of road in Middle America. The girl could very well be shy or uncomfortable around strangers, and the man might simply be a concerned guardian. But the unease gnawing at him wouldn't go away. As the minutes ticked by, David found himself wrestling with a growing sense of responsibility. His coffee was growing cold in his hands, but he barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the small girl in the red dress, on her nervous glances and fidgeting hands, on the man's unwavering stare. He couldn't leave, not yet, not until he was certain that his concerns were unfounded. And so, he settled in for a longer stay, his watchful gaze never leaving the curious pair by the window. Bookmark. As David continued to watch the scene unfold, he felt his instincts sharpening, his mind moving into an almost meditative focus. The quiet din of the diner faded into the background as he analyzed every small movement, every glance, every gesture between the man and the girl. The girl, Lily, as he overheard the man call her softly, looked even more anxious as time passed. Her fingers had now stopped their drumming, and instead, she clasped her hands together tightly in her lap, as if to steady herself. David noticed the way her shoulders hunched forward slightly, making her seem even smaller in the oversized booth seat. Her gaze, once darting around the diner in quick, furtive movements, had settled on the surface of the table, her eyes downcast. Occasionally she glanced up at Mark, only to immediately look away when she saw that he was watching her. The unease continued to gnaw at David. His years in the military had taught him to trust his gut, to pay attention to those subtle, almost imperceptible signs that could mean the difference between life and death. But now, as he stood there in this quiet, ordinary diner, he found himself questioning those instincts. He was no longer in a war zone. This wasn't a situation where he could simply react on impulse. The stakes felt different, more complicated. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to weigh the facts rationally. This could be nothing more than a misunderstanding, a case of his hyper-awareness playing tricks on him. The girl might simply be shy, perhaps uncomfortable around people she didn't know. And the man? Well, he could be her guardian, her stepfather, or even a family friend. There were countless explanations that didn't involve anything sinister. But as he watched Lily shift uncomfortably in her seat, her body tense and rigid, he found it increasingly difficult to convince himself that everything was fine. He knew what genuine affection looked like. He'd seen it countless times in the faces of his friends when they talked about their own children. The look Mark was giving Lily was something else entirely. A look of control, of possessiveness that made David's skin crawl. Taking another sip of his now lukewarm coffee, David shifted his stance, leaning casually against the vending machine as he continued to observe. The man seemed oblivious to David's presence, his attention focused solely on the child sitting across from him. Mark's eyes, sharp and calculating, watched every movement Lily made, as if assessing her, trying to gauge her reactions. There was a stillness to him that felt unnatural, a kind of tightly controlled patience that set David's nerves on edge. Just then, Lily did something that caught David's attention in an entirely new way. She raised one small hand slightly, her palm facing outward, her fingers spread wide. The gesture was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but to David, it stood out like a flare in the night. He had seen similar signals before, in situations where people couldn't openly ask for help. It was a gesture often used in high-stress environments, a silent plea for assistance when words were too dangerous to speak. David's heart began to pound, a chill running down his spine as he considered the implications. He had read about this exact gesture. It was becoming known as a universal signal for distress, something that even children were being taught to use if they ever found themselves in a dangerous situation. Could it be that this girl was trying to signal for help? Was she too afraid to speak, too scared to say aloud what she was feeling? His mind raced with possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. If Lily truly was in danger, if she was attempting to communicate her fear through this subtle hand signal, then David couldn't simply stand by and watch. His sense of duty flared up inside him, pushing aside his doubts. Whether or not this was a misunderstanding, he couldn't ignore that silent plea, couldn't walk away and risk being wrong. As he considered his next move, he saw Lily's eyes meet his once more, this time holding his gaze a fraction longer. In that brief connection, David saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a mixture of fear and hope that struck him deeply. She looked as if she were clinging to some fragile thread of courage, desperately trying to hold on. Mark, sensing her distraction, leaned forward slightly, murmuring something under his breath. David couldn't hear the words, but he saw their effect on Lily immediately. Her small frame tensed, her shoulders hunching even further as if she were trying to make herself invisible. Mark's eyes remained fixed on her, his gaze intense and unyielding, a look that seemed to warn her against any further attempts at signaling. David felt his fists clench involuntarily, his body responding instinctively to the scene unfolding before him. His mind was now racing, considering his options. He could approach them directly, confront the man, and ask if everything was all right. But he knew that such a move carried risks. If he was wrong, if this really was a misunderstanding, he could cause unnecessary distress. And if he was right, if this man was indeed dangerous, confronting him openly might put Lily in even greater danger. He weighed his options, his eyes never leaving the pair. His military training urged him to act, to intervene and protect the child. But his civilian sensibilities reminded him that he was in a public place, that he couldn't simply act on impulse. He needed a plan, a way to approach the situation with caution, without escalating it prematurely. After a moment of deliberation, David made a decision. He would wait, watch for any further signs of distress, any additional signals that might confirm his suspicions. If Lily made the hand gesture again, if she gave him any indication that she truly needed help, then he would intervene. Until then, he would remain vigilant, ready to act at a moment's notice. As he settled back against the wall, his senses fully alert, David felt a sense of clarity wash over him. He knew that the decision to wait, to observe carefully, was the right one. But he also knew that he couldn't ignore his instincts. If Lily was in danger, if this man truly posed a threat to her, then he would do whatever was necessary to protect her. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity. David's coffee had long since gone cold, but he barely noticed. His entire focus was on the small girl in the red dress and the man who watched her with such unsettling intensity. As he waited, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something significant, something that would require him to draw on every ounce of courage and discipline he had. He had faced dangers before, and had been in situations where his life was on the line, but this felt different. This was a quiet battle, A test of patience and perception, a moment where the lines between right and wrong, action and inaction were frustratingly blurred. But one thing was clear to him. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not until he was certain that Lily was safe. As David kept his silent watch, he noticed the subtle but telling signs of Lily's growing tension. The child seemed frozen in her seat, her movements barely perceptible, her posture stiff. Her hands, once clasped tightly in her lap, now rested on the table. Every so often she would glance around, her eyes wide, as if hoping someone might notice her plight. David knew he needed to stay calm, but his pulse quickened as his concern grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that this quiet tension in the diner could shift at any moment. The man across from Lily continued to hold his newspaper, occasionally glancing at her with an unsettling look that David couldn't ignore. Every muscle in David's body was tense, his instincts ready to kick in if the situation escalated. Then, just when he thought he'd have to step in without further confirmation, Lily made the hand signal again. This time, it was even more deliberate. Her small hand raising just a few inches above the table, her palm facing outward, fingers spread wide. The motion was subtle, but to David, it was unmistakable. She was asking for help. David's heart skipped a beat as he watched Lily's eyes scan the room, her gaze lingering on him for a fleeting second. In that brief moment, he felt the weight of her fear, her desperation. The signal, paired with the fear in her eyes, left no doubt in his mind. Lily was in danger. Taking a deep, steadying breath, David felt his training kick in, his mind racing through possible ways to handle the situation. Confronting Mark directly could be risky. He needed to approach this carefully and strategically. David knew he had to assess the situation closely, ensuring Lily's safety without tipping Mark off too soon. As he moved toward the counter to order something more substantial, David saw Lily's posture change slightly. She seemed to shrink further into herself, her small shoulders hunched, her hands now clutching the edge of the table. Mark leaned in close, murmuring something to her that David couldn't hear. But he saw the effect immediately. Lily's body grew even tenser, her gaze darting away from him, her face tightening in fear. It was as if Mark's words had pulled her deeper into a place of silent terror. David clenched his jaw, his resolve strengthening. He couldn't simply stand by and let this continue. But before he could approach the table, he felt the familiar weight of his cell phone in his pocket, reminding him that he had another option. Taking a step back from the counter, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911, keeping his voice low as he spoke to the operator. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice cut through the tension. This is David Harper, he began, his tone clipped and precise. I'm at the Ember Grove Rest Stop Diner on Highway 27. There's a young girl here, black, about 8 years old, wearing a red dress. She's with an older man, in his early 50s, white, wearing a navy suit. I believe the child is in distress and may be attempting to signal for help. He provided a quick, detailed description of both Lily and Mark, emphasizing the girl's apparent fear and the man's controlling behavior. I'm a former Marine, he added, hoping the information might lend credibility to his report. Something isn't right here. The girl seems terrified, and I've observed her make what I believe to be a distress signal twice now. The operator's voice took on a more urgent tone. We're dispatching officers to your location, Mr. Harper. Please stay on the line and remain in a safe position. Do not attempt to intervene directly unless the child is in immediate danger. David acknowledged the instructions, his eyes never leaving the table where Lily sat with Mark. He was all too aware that things could shift at any moment. Mark might decide to leave, or worse, realize that David had noticed something amiss. Every second counted, and David knew that his role was to keep a close eye on the situation until the police arrived. As he ended the call, he positioned himself by the window, giving himself a clear view of the pair while still appearing casual to any bystanders. Outside, the sun had nearly set, casting the diner in a dim, golden glow. The parking lot was quiet, with only a few cars scattered across the cracked asphalt. But David's focus remained razor-sharp, his senses attuned to every movement, every glance, every small detail. Then, through the large windows, he saw something that made his heart race with a mixture of relief and urgency, flashing lights in the distance, the telltale sign of approaching police cars. The diner's peaceful ambiance remained undisturbed, but to David, those flashing lights meant the arrival of backup, a chance to ensure Lily's safety without putting her at further risk. Inside, the atmosphere remained calm, oblivious to the unfolding situation. The other patrons continued their meals, unaware of the silent drama playing out in the corner booth. David glanced toward the counter, where the waitress was wiping down surfaces, humming softly to herself. No one else seemed to notice the silent exchanges between Lily and Mark, or the tension radiating from the small girl. Then, as the police cars pulled into the parking lot, David's attention snapped back to Lily. Mark, who had been watching her with that same cold intensity, suddenly stiffened, as if sensing the shift. His gaze flickered toward the window, and David noticed the way his jaw tightened, his expression shifting from calm detachment to something more alert, almost wary. For a split second, David feared that Mark might try to make a run for it, dragging Lily with him. But just as Mark began to stand, David saw the police officers stepping out of their cars, their uniforms a stark contrast against the soft glow of the evening. Relief washed over him, knowing that help had finally arrived. Without hesitation, David strode toward the entrance, catching the officer's attention with a subtle wave. The two officers, a man and a woman, nodded in acknowledgement as they approached. David quickly filled them in on the details, keeping his voice low to avoid drawing unwanted attention. "That's them," he said, nodding discreetly toward the booth. "The man in the suit and the young girl in the red dress. She's shown visible signs of distress and has made a distress signal multiple times. I believe he's holding her against her will." The officers exchanged a look, their expressions turning serious as they took in the information. The female officer, Officer Ramirez, took the lead, her demeanor calm but assertive as she prepared to approach the table. David watched as the officers advanced, their steps measured, their eyes focused on the man and the girl. The air in the diner seemed to thicken with tension, a quiet unease settling over the space as the officers closed in. Mark noticed their approach and visibly tensed, his hand clenching the edge of the table as he attempted to mask his surprise. His gaze flickered to Lily, his face a mask of controlled panic, and David saw the way Lily shrank under his gaze, her small body tensing in fear. As the officers reached the booth, Officer Ramirez spoke, her voice steady and firm. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions. Could you please step away from the child?" Mark's face shifted, his expression hardening as he looked from the officers to David, his eyes narrowing with a mix of anger and defiance. For a moment, he seemed to consider resisting, but the sight of the officers, their calm authority, made him think twice. Lily's eyes widened as she watched the interaction, her gaze darting between the officers, Mark and David, who stood nearby, his posture calm but watchful. At that moment, David saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, a small but unmistakable sign that she understood help had finally arrived. Mark hesitated, his eyes shifting between the officers and David, his mask of calm beginning to falter. David watched as the officers maintained their composure, sensing Mark's internal struggle. Officer Ramirez stood firmly by the table, her gaze unwavering as she addressed Mark with a tone that left no room for negotiation. "Sir, please step away from the child," she repeated, her voice firm but not overly aggressive. Mark's jaw clenched, and for a brief moment, David feared that he might attempt something reckless. The man's gaze flickered toward the exit, a fleeting but telling glance that revealed his instinct to escape. David felt his body tense, ready to intervene if necessary. After a few agonizing seconds, Mark released his grip on the edge of the table, his shoulders slumping slightly as he forced a smile. "Of course, officers. There's no problem here," he said, his voice tight and controlled. He looked down at Lily, his expression softening in a way that felt forced and unnatural. "We're just having a quiet meal together. Isn't that right, Lily?" The girl remained silent, her small frame stiff and unmoving. Her gaze was fixed on the tabletop, her hands gripping the edges of the booth seat so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. David's heart ached at the sight of her fear, her body language telling a story that her voice couldn't. Officer Ramirez turned her attention to Lily, crouching down to meet her eye level. Her demeanor softened, her tone gentle as she spoke to the frightened child. "Hi, Lily. My name is Officer Ramirez. Can you tell me if everything is okay?" Lily looked up, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. She glanced at Mark, her gaze flickering between him and Officer Ramirez, as if searching for permission to speak. David could see the hesitation in her eyes, the weight of her silence. Mark quickly interjected, his voice adopting a tone that sounded almost patronizing. "Lily is a shy one," he said with a strained chuckle, his gaze shifting between the officers and David. "She doesn't talk much around strangers, but I assure you there's no issue here. We're just on a little road trip together." David felt his fists clench at Mark's dismissive tone, his every instinct telling him that this man was dangerous, that his words were designed to manipulate and control. He could see through Mark's facade and could sense the barely contained anger simmering beneath the surface of his forced calm. But Officer Ramirez wasn't easily deterred. She kept her attention on Lily, offering a reassuring smile. "It's okay, Lily. You can talk to us. We're here to help you." Lily's small voice broke the tense silence, so quiet that David had to strain to hear her. I. She stammered, her eyes darting to Mark, who was watching her with a look that could only be described as a warning. David's heart sank as he saw Lily's body language shift, her shoulders hunching further, her gaze dropping back to the table. But Officer Ramirez didn't back down. She gave Lily a small nod, her expression encouraging. "You're safe, Lily. You don't have to be afraid." Lily glanced up again, her gaze lingering on Officer Ramirez. For a moment, David saw a spark of bravery in her eyes, a flicker of courage that seemed to build with the officer's gentle reassurance. She took a shaky breath, her small hands loosening their grip on the booth seat. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I need help." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with a desperation that struck David deeply. It was the admission they had all been waiting for, a small but powerful cry for help that shattered any remaining doubts. Mark's calm facade broke, his face twisting into an expression of anger and frustration. "Lily," he said sharply, his voice laced with a warning edge. "That's enough." David took a step forward, his stance protective, as he positioned himself between Mark and Lily. The officers immediately shifted their posture, their hands moving subtly toward their belts, prepared for any sudden movement from Mark. Officer Ramirez's partner, Officer Taylor, spoke up, his tone firm and authoritative. "Sir, please back away from the child. We're going to ask you some questions, and we'll need you to cooperate." Mark's face paled, his eyes darting around the diner as if searching for an escape. His demeanor shifted from confident to cornered, and David could see the panic beginning to set in. Mark opened his mouth to protest, but the sight of the officer's steady, unyielding expressions seemed to silence him. "This is all a misunderstanding," Mark said, his voice unsteady. "She's my niece. We're just having a quiet meal together. I don't understand why all this is necessary." Officer Ramirez's expression remained calm, but there was a steely determination in her eyes. "If that's true, then there's no reason for you to be concerned, sir," she replied, her tone measured. "But until we verify your relationship with the child, we're going to need you to answer a few questions." Mark's gaze flickered toward David, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of anger and accusation. "This is your doing, isn't it?" he hissed, his voice low but filled with venom. "You couldn't mind your own business." David held his ground, meeting Mark's glare without flinching. "If this is truly a misunderstanding," he replied calmly, "then you have nothing to worry about." Mark's fists clenched at his sides, and for a brief moment David feared he might try to lash out. But the presence of the officers seemed to restrain him, forcing him to hold back the anger simmering beneath his carefully constructed facade. The tension in the diner was palpable, a silent standoff between the officers, Mark and David. The other patrons had gone quiet, their gazes drawn to the unfolding confrontation. David could feel the weight of their attention, the sense that they, too, were beginning to see through Mark's charade. Finally, Mark let out a frustrated sigh, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Ask your questions, but this is all a waste of time." Officer Taylor nodded, his expression unwavering. "We'll start with some basic information. What's your name, sir?" "Mark," he replied through gritted teeth. "Mark Smith." And the girl, what's her full name? Officer Taylor continued, his tone steady. Mark hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Her name is Lily Anderson, he said, stumbling slightly over the last name as if he were struggling to remember it. David's suspicions deepened at Mark's hesitation. He could see the same realization dawning in the officer's eyes, a small but telling sign that Mark's story wasn't as solid as he'd like them to believe. Meanwhile, Lily sat quietly, her gaze fixed on Officer Ramirez, a hint of relief beginning to replace the fear in her eyes. David felt a surge of protectiveness for the young girl, a fierce determination to see this through, to ensure that Mark couldn't manipulate or control her any longer. As the questioning continued, Mark's responses grew increasingly strained, his attempts to appear calm unraveling with each passing moment. The officers exchanged glances, their suspicions clearly mounting as they began to piece together the inconsistencies in his story. David watched closely, his every sense attuned to the subtle shifts in the conversation, the quiet unraveling of Mark's fabricated story. He knew that they were on the verge of uncovering the truth, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to protect Lily from the man who had so clearly terrified her. But back. As the questioning continued, it became increasingly clear that Mark's story was falling apart. The officer's calm but direct inquiries chipped away at the false narrative he had tried to present. Each time they pressed him for detail, his responses grew more stilted, more hesitant, revealing cracks in his carefully crafted facade. David watched as Officer Ramirez leaned in, her gaze steady as she met Mark's eyes. "If you're her uncle, as you claim, I'm sure you won't mind showing us some form of identification," she said, her tone polite but unyielding. "And if you have any documentation that confirms your relationship with her, that would also be helpful." Mark's face tightened, his hand fumbling in his jacket pocket as he pulled out his wallet. He seemed to hesitate before handing over his driver's license as if weighing the potential consequences. David could see the nervous tension in his movements, the slight tremor in his hand as he reluctantly passed the license to Officer Ramirez. "Thank you," she said, examining the ID closely before passing it to her partner. "Now, Mr. Smith, do you have any paperwork or identification for the child? Perhaps a birth certificate, school record, or anything that can verify her relationship to you?" Mark's jaw clenched, his gaze flickering briefly to Lily, who sat silently in the booth, watching the exchange with a mixture of fear and cautious hope. David could see the tension in Mark's expression, the barely contained frustration, as he realized he was running out of excuses. "Look, I don't carry that sort of thing around with me," Mark replied, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "We're on a road trip, for heaven's sake. I didn't think I'd need a stack of paperwork just to spend time with my niece." Officer Ramirez remained unfazed, her expression calm as she nodded. "That's understandable, Mr. Smith, but in situations where a child appears distressed, we have to follow certain protocols to ensure their safety." David could see Mark's frustration mounting, his face flushing with a mixture of anger and anxiety. He opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, Officer Taylor interjected, his voice calm but authoritative. "Mr. Smith, we're only asking you these questions to clear up any confusion. If everything is as you say, we'll be able to verify it and be on our way." Mark forced a strained smile, nodding stiffly. "Of course," he muttered, his voice barely concealing his irritation. But the tension in his posture told a different story, one of frustration, resentment, and a growing realization that he was losing control of the situation. As the questioning continued, David felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The officers were closing in, their calm persistence unraveling the lies that Mark had used to keep Lily under his control. And though the process was slow, David could see that it was having an effect. Mark's confidence was crumbling, his responses becoming increasingly disjointed and evasive. Just then, Officer Ramirez turned her attention back to Lily, her expression softening as she addressed the frightened child. "Lily, honey, can you tell us a little more about yourself?" she asked gently. "Where do you live? Do you have a favorite toy or a pet at home?" Lily hesitated, her eyes flickering to Mark before she answered in a barely audible voice. I live with my dad," she whispered, her gaze lowering as she spoke. "We have a dog named Scout." David's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice, the small but unmistakable signs of trust that she was beginning to place in the officers. He could see that Lily was torn between her fear of Mark and the hope that these strangers might be able to protect her. Mark's face darkened as he listened, his hands clenching into fists beneath the table. "Lily, sweetheart, remember what we talked about," he said, his voice adopting a sickly sweet tone that sent a shiver down David's spine. "Don't bother these nice people with silly stories." But Officer Ramirez was undeterred. She met Lily's gaze with a reassuring smile, her tone gentle as she continued. "It's okay, Lily. You're not bothering us at all. We just want to make sure you're safe." Lily glanced between the officers and Mark, her small frame tense as if she were bracing herself. David could see the internal struggle playing out in her eyes, the fear and hesitation that had kept her silent for so long. But there was also a flicker of determination, a spark of courage that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. Finally, she took a shaky breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I want to go home," she said, her words barely above a whisper. "I want to see my dad." The quiet admission seemed to hang in the air, heavy with significance. David felt a surge of protectiveness for Lily, his resolve strengthening as he watched her take this small but courageous step. It was as if she had finally allowed herself to hope, to believe that these strangers might be able to help her escape from the man who had kept her in fear. Mark's composure shattered at her words, his face contorting with anger. "That's enough, Lily," he snapped, his tone sharp and threatening. "You're just tired and confused. We talked about this, remember?" Officer Ramirez's expression hardened, her gaze locking onto Mark with a steely intensity. "Mr. Smith, please step back from the child," she said firmly. "We'll need you to remain seated while we continue our conversation with her." Mark's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he looked from the officers to David, a look of defiance in his gaze. For a brief, tense moment, it seemed as if he might try to resist, to assert control over the situation. But the officer's calm authority held him in check, forcing him to comply. With a reluctant nod, Mark leaned back in his seat, his posture rigid and unyielding. But David could see the fury simmering beneath his calm exterior, the resentment that was barely contained as he watched the officers speak to Lily. Officer Ramirez continued, her tone gentle as she encouraged Lily to share more. "Can you tell us where your dad is, Lily? Does he know where you are?" Lily looked down, her small hands fidgeting in her lap. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. He doesn't know. I didn't get to say goodbye." David felt a pang of anger mixed with sadness at her words, the quiet heartache of a child who had been taken from her family, forced into a situation that she didn't understand and couldn't control. The officers exchanged a look, their suspicions now fully confirmed. They had all the confirmation they needed, and the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. This was no simple misunderstanding. It was a situation far darker and more complex than any of them had anticipated. Officer Taylor turned to Mark, his tone sharp. "Mr. Smith, we're going to need you to come with us to the station for further questioning. Until we can verify your claims, the child will remain in our custody." Mark's face went pale, his bravado evaporating as the reality of his situation sank in. He opened his mouth to protest, to insist on his innocence, but the resolve in the officer's eyes told him that there would be no escaping the truth. As the officers moved to escort Mark out of the diner, David felt a sense of relief wash over him. The danger had passed and Lily was safe. But he knew that this was only the beginning. A long road lay ahead for her, a path to healing from the fear and uncertainty that had plagued her. For now, though, she was free. And that, David knew, was worth every moment of vigilance, every ounce of courage it had taken to stay and watch. As Mark was led out of the diner in handcuffs, David watched with a profound sense of relief. The officers escorted him to a police car waiting outside, his protests growing louder with each step. "This is all a mistake," Mark shouted, his voice laced with desperation. "You don't understand. She's my family." But his words fell on deaf ears. The officers were resolute, their expressions grim as they placed him into the back of the police car. The door closed with a heavy thud, sealing Mark inside. For the first time since entering the diner, David allowed himself to exhale fully. the tension that had coiled within him finally beginning to release. Inside, the diner had fallen into an unusual quiet. The remaining patrons, who had been watching the scene unfold with silent fascination, slowly resumed their conversations, their voices a subdued murmur against the background hum of the diner. David could feel the lingering tension in the air, the weight of what had just occurred pressing down on everyone present. But he didn't linger on it. His focus was on Lily, the small, frightened girl who sat alone in the booth, her wide eyes watching the officers and David with a mixture of relief and trepidation. Officer Ramirez approached Lily once more, her voice gentle as she spoke. "Lily, sweetheart, everything's going to be okay now. You're safe." The officer extended her hand, inviting Lily to step out of the booth. Lily looked up, her gaze shifting from the officer's kind eyes to David, her expression hesitant but filled with gratitude. Slowly, she rose from her seat, clutching the edge of the table as if it were the only solid thing in her world. David felt his heartaches as he watched her, the reality of what she had endured settling heavily within him. This was a young girl who had been torn from her family and thrust into a situation she couldn't understand. Her resilience, her bravery in signaling for help, was a testament to her strength, but he knew that she was just a child. She should never have had to be that strong, never had to feel that kind of fear. As Lily stepped out of the booth, David moved closer, his presence a steadying force beside her. He knelt down, meeting her eye level, and offered her a reassuring smile. "Hey, Lily," he said softly. "You did really well. You're safe now, okay?" Lily nodded, her lips pressed tightly together as if holding back tears. She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability, her small shoulders trembling slightly as the adrenaline of the moment began to fade. David resisted the urge to reach out and comfort her, knowing that she needed space and time to process everything that had just happened. Officer Ramirez glanced between David and Lily, her expression softening as she watched their interaction. "Lily," she said gently, "we're going to take you to the station. We need to contact your family and make sure they know where you are." Lily looked at the officer, her gaze filled with a mix of hope and fear. Will my dad be there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sweetheart," Officer Ramirez replied with a reassuring smile. "We'll make sure your dad is there to take you home." David felt a surge of relief at the officer's words, grateful that Lily would soon be reunited with her family. But as he watched her small, tired frame, he knew that this experience would stay with her, that the trauma of the past hours would take time to heal. Just then, Officer Taylor approached David, his expression respectful as he nodded toward him. "Sir, we'll need you to come to the station as well," he said. "We'll need a full statement about everything you witnessed." David nodded, understanding the importance of providing an accurate account of the events. "Of course," he replied, his tone steady. "I'll do whatever I can to help." As they made their way toward the exit, David stayed close to Lily, his presence a silent reassurance. The officers led them to a squad car parked nearby, its flashing lights casting a soft glow over the parking lot. Lily climbed into the back seat with Officer Ramirez, her small figure silhouetted against the car's interior. David followed, taking a seat beside her as the officers prepared to drive them to the station. The ride was quiet. The only sounds were the hum of the car's engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. David glanced at Lily, who sat beside him, her gaze distant as she stared out the window. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the toll that the day's events had taken on her. When they arrived at the station, the fluorescent lights in the building's lobby cast a harsh glow over the bustling room. Officers moved about with purpose, their voices low as they coordinated the details of the case. In one corner, David saw Mark sitting handcuffed to a chair, his once confident demeanor shattered, his face pale with defeat. He seemed smaller now, diminished by the weight of his actions and the consequences that awaited him. As they walked past, Mark's gaze briefly met David's, a look of bitterness and resentment flickering in his eyes. But David didn't flinch. He met Mark's glare with a calm, unwavering resolve, his expression unyielding. At that moment he felt no sympathy, no doubt about the choices he had made. This man had stolen a child, had filled her life with fear and confusion, and David had no regrets about the role he had played in stopping him. Lily, thankfully, didn't seem to notice Mark as they were led into a quieter part of the station. Officer Ramirez guided her to a small, comfortable room, its walls painted in soft colors to create a sense of calm. A kind-faced woman, one of the station's child specialists, introduced herself to Lily, her gentle demeanor immediately putting the young girl at ease. David remained nearby, watching as the child specialist spoke softly to Lily, explaining that they needed her to answer a few questions. Lily nodded, her voice barely a whisper as she responded. David knew that this part would be difficult for her, but he also understood that it was necessary, a step toward ensuring that justice would be served. As Lily spoke with the specialist, David was approached by one of the officers. "Mr. Harper," he said, his tone respectful. "We'd like to take your statement now. If you could come with me, please." David glanced back at Lily, who was answering the specialist's questions with quiet bravery. He nodded, following the officer to another room, ready to recount every detail he had observed in the diner. The questioning was thorough, each detail scrutinized carefully, and David answered every question with the clarity and focus that his military training had instilled in him. As he finished his statement, the officer looked at him with gratitude. "You did the right thing," he said, his tone sincere. "Many people would have ignored the situation, assumed it was none of their business, but you may have saved that little girl's life." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I just couldn't walk away," he replied. "She needed help. I only did what anyone should do." As he exited the room, he found Lily waiting for him in the lobby, a soft but exhausted smile on her face. The relief in her eyes was unmistakable, a quiet gratitude that spoke volumes. David knelt down beside her, offering a gentle smile in return. "You're going to be okay, Lily," he said softly. "You're safe now, and soon you'll be back with your dad." Lily nodded, her small fingers reaching out to grasp his hand. In that simple gesture, David felt a profound sense of connection, a reminder of the impact one person's actions could have on another's life. David was still holding Lily's small hand when the station door opened suddenly, and a man rushed inside, his face a mixture of panic and relief. His eyes, wide with worry, searched the room until they landed on Lily. The man froze, his gaze fixed on his daughter, and for a brief moment, he looked as if he couldn't believe she was real, standing there in front of him. "Lily," he choked out, his voice cracking with emotion. Lily's head snapped up, her eyes widening in recognition. She let go of David's hand and ran to her father, her small frame colliding with his. She threw her arms around him. "Daddy," she cried, her voice filled with relief and joy. She clung to him, her face buried in his shoulder as he held her tightly, his hands gently smoothing her hair as if to reassure himself that she was truly there, safe and unharmed. David watched the reunion in silence, a sense of profound satisfaction settling over him. Seeing Lily safe in her father's arms, knowing that she was finally out of danger, made everything worth it, the tension, the worry, the difficult decisions. This was the moment he had hoped for, the outcome he had fought to achieve. The man, who introduced himself as Lily's father, Nathan, lifted his daughter's face to meet his eyes, his own gaze filled with an indescribable mixture of love and relief. "I was so worried," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I thought I'd lost you." Lily's eyes filled with tears as she hugged him tighter, her small body trembling slightly as the weight of the day's events finally caught up with her. "I missed you, Daddy," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan held her close, whispering words of comfort and reassurance as he cradled her in his arms. David felt a sense of peace wash over him, a quiet sense of accomplishment that came from knowing he had made the right choice by intervening, by trusting his instincts, even when he had doubted himself. After a few minutes, Nathan looked up, his eyes meeting David's. He offered a shaky smile, his voice filled with gratitude as he spoke. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his tone earnest. "You saved my little girl. If you hadn't been there—" David shook his head, feeling a bit uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what anyone should do," he replied, his tone humble. "I couldn't ignore it. She needed help." Nathan's expression softened, his gratitude evident in his gaze. "It may have seemed like the right thing to you, but most people would have looked the other way. he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "I don't even want to think about what could have happened if you hadn't stepped in." David nodded, understanding the weight behind Nathan's words. He had often been in situations where his instincts had been all that stood between him and danger, but this felt different. This time, it wasn't his own life at stake. It was the life of a child who had depended on him to see through the surface and recognize the silent plea for help. Just then, Officer Ramirez approached, her expression kind but serious as she addressed Nathan. "Mr. Carter, we'll need to go through a few formalities," she said, her tone gentle. "There's paperwork to complete, and we'll need to document Lily's statement for the investigation. But we'll make this as quick as possible." Nathan nodded, keeping his arm around Lily's shoulders as they followed Officer Ramirez to a quiet area of the station. David watched them go, his heart warmed by the sight of Nathan's protective embrace, the way he held his daughter close as if he would never let her go again. As he waited, David's thoughts drifted to the events of the day. The quiet diner, the initial spark of suspicion, the chilling realization that Lily was in danger, it all seemed surreal, as if it had happened to someone else. And yet, every detail was etched into his memory, each moment replaying in his mind with a clarity that left him feeling both grateful and humbled by the experience. About 20 minutes later, Nathan and Lily returned, accompanied by Officer Ramirez, who had a soft smile on her face. She looked at David, nodding in acknowledgement. "Thank you again, Mr. Harper. We'll be following up with additional investigations, but you've done more than enough today." David nodded, but his focus was on Lily, who approached him hesitantly, her eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and lingering exhaustion. She reached out, taking his hand once more, her small fingers wrapping around his with a quiet sense of trust. "Thank you, Mr. David," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You helped me when I didn't know what else to do." David's heart swelled at her words, his voice gentle as he replied. "You were very brave, Lily. You knew what to do, and you asked for help. That took courage." Lily nodded, a small smile spreading across her face as she looked up at her father. Nathan smiled too, his expression one of deep pride and relief. "We're forever grateful to you, David," he said sincerely. "If there's ever anything I can do to repay you—" David shook his head, brushing off the sentiment with a modest smile. "There's no need for that," he replied, his tone sincere. "Just take care of her. That's all I'd want." But Nathan seemed determined to find a way to show his gratitude. "At least let us invite you over," he insisted. "Come to our home. It's the least we can do. You're family now, in a way." David hesitated, but the look of hope and appreciation in Nathan's eyes made it hard to refuse. He nodded finally, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "All right," he agreed, his tone warm. "I'd be honored." Lily's face lit up at his response, her small hand giving him a gentle squeeze. For a moment, they stood there in comfortable silence, the bond that had formed between them unspoken but undeniable. As they prepared to leave, David took one last look around the station, his gaze lingering on the people who had played a part in ensuring Lily's safety. He felt a profound sense of closure, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he had made a difference. But as he looked at Lily and her father, he knew that this was only the beginning of a new journey, for both of them, and perhaps even for him. With a final nod to the officers, David turned and followed Nathan and Lily out into the cool night air, a sense of calm settling over him as he stepped into the next chapter of this unexpected story, one that had brought him closer to others in a way he hadn't anticipated. 2 days after the events at the diner, David found himself standing in front of Nathan's modest suburban home. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the neighborhood, children's laughter echoing faintly from a nearby yard. David shifted the small gift he'd brought, a colorful toy dog he thought Lily might like, in his hands as he took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of anticipation and curiosity. He hadn't expected an invitation to join them so soon, and certainly not as part of a family gathering. The front door swung open before he could knock, and Nathan greeted him with a wide, genuine smile. "David, you're right on time. Come in," he said warmly, stepping aside to let him in. David stepped inside, his senses immediately filled with the inviting sense of barbecue and laughter filling the air. The house was cozy, the walls adorned with family photos and small, colorful drawings that looked like they'd been created by a young child, Lily, no doubt. He felt an odd sense of comfort here, a stark contrast to the chaos and fear of the diner just days before. "Everyone's out back," Nathan said, leading him through the living room and into the backyard. There, a small group of friends and family gathered, mingling as they enjoyed the food and the warm evening air. Lily was in the center of it all, her small figure bouncing with energy as she played with a few neighborhood kids. The sight of her laughing, her cheeks flushed with excitement, was a far cry from the scared, withdrawn girl he'd met in that diner. When Lily spotted him, her face lit up, and she immediately ran over, her excitement palpable. "Mr. David," she called out, her voice bright and cheerful. David knelt down to greet her, smiling as he held out the small toy dog. "Hey, Lily, I brought you a little friend," he said, watching her face light up as she took the toy in her hands. "Thank you," she exclaimed, hugging the toy tightly. Her expression softened as she looked up at him, her voice quiet but sincere. "I'm really glad you're here." David felt a warmth in his chest at her words, the simple honesty in her gaze making him realize just how much this small connection meant to both of them. He had been drawn into her life under the most unusual circumstances, and yet, seeing her happy and safe here felt natural, as if this moment was the result of some invisible thread connecting their paths. Nathan approached with a plate of food, handing it to David with a grin. "Nothing fancy, just burgers and hot dogs," he said, his tone light. "But it's the least we could do to thank you." David accepted the plate, nodding appreciatively. "This is more than enough," he replied. "Thank you for inviting me." The three of them settled at a picnic table, the sounds of conversation and laughter drifting around them. For a moment, they simply enjoyed the meal, a comfortable silence between them that felt like a reprieve from everything that had happened. David found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in a long time, the weight of the past few days gradually lifting. As they finished eating, Nathan glanced at David, his expression growing thoughtful. "I still can't believe everything that happened," he said quietly, his gaze drifting to Lily, who was now busy playing with the toy David had given her. "It's like a nightmare you can't wake up from." David nodded, his expression serious. "I can only imagine," he replied, "but she's safe now. That's what matters." Nathan looked down, his expression conflicted. "You know, there's more to this story," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than I shared at the station." David raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. He had sensed that there might be hidden layers to this story, but he hadn't pressed for details, respecting the privacy of the family's ordeal. Nathan took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he met David's eyes. "Lily's mother, we went through a very difficult divorce," he began, his voice tinged with sadness. "There were issues, things I didn't see until it was too late. The court awarded me full custody because her mother's behavior was unstable, but I never thought it would come to this." David listened intently, understanding the weight of what Nathan was revealing. Custody battles were rarely simple, often filled with complexities that outsiders couldn't understand. And yet, seeing the lengths that Lily's mother had gone to, coordinating with Mark, and attempting to take Lily without permission, David realized just how dangerous the situation had truly been. "The police found documents in Mark's possession," Nathan continued, his voice tight with anger. "They had planned to take her out of the country, to disappear and hide her from me. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't noticed." Nathan's voice trailed off, a mixture of anger and fear in his eyes, as he considered what might have happened if David hadn't intervened. David felt the gravity of Nathan's words settles over him, the reality of how close they had come to losing Lily forever. "You don't have to thank me," David said quietly. "I was just in the right place at the right time. And Lily, she's the one who had the courage to ask for help." Nathan nodded, a hint of admiration in his gaze as he looked at his daughter. "She's stronger than I could have ever imagined," he replied softly, "but she shouldn't have had to be." David understood the unspoken sentiment behind Nathan's words. No child should have to bear the weight of such fear, to feel unsafe with those who were supposed to protect them. He knew that Lily's journey wouldn't end here. that there would be challenges ahead as she healed from the trauma of the past few days. But seeing her laughter, her joy as she played with her new friends, he felt hopeful that she would overcome it, that her resilience would carry her through. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the backyard, Nathan raised his glass, his expression filled with gratitude. "To David," he said, his voice filled with sincerity, "for doing what most people wouldn't." The small group of family and friends echoed the sentiment, raising their glasses in a quiet but heartfelt toast. David felt a bit embarrassed, not used to being the center of attention, but he raised his glass in return, nodding appreciatively. "To Lily," he replied, his voice warm, "for being braver than most." The toast brought a smile to everyone's faces, a shared moment of connection that transcended the harrowing events of the past. David felt a deep sense of belonging, an unexpected kinship with this family that had welcomed him so openly. As the gathering began to wind down, David prepared to say his goodbyes. Lily ran up to him one last time, her face filled with joy as she hugged him tightly. "Will I see you again, Mr. David?" she asked, her voice hopeful. David smiled, his heart warmed by her words. "I'd like that very much, Lily," he replied, ruffling her hair gently. With a final wave to Nathan and the others, David stepped back into the quiet evening, the cool air refreshing as he made his way to his car. He looked back one last time, seeing Lily and her father standing side by side, their faces filled with warmth and gratitude. As he drove away, David felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a quiet knowledge that he had made a difference. He had stopped for a cup of coffee, never expecting to become part of a family's story, to play a role in reuniting a father and daughter. And as the road stretched out before him, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles were fought in the quiet moments, when one person's courage could change the course of another's life. Bookmark, go back. The drive home was quiet, the stars beginning to dot the darkening sky as David replayed the day's events in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling of warmth and connection he'd felt with Lily and Nathan. It was unlike anything he'd experienced in years. He'd grown used to a life of independence and solitude after leaving the military, and he hadn't expected to feel such a strong bond with this family. Pulling into his driveway, David turned off the car and sat in the stillness for a moment, letting his mind wander. In his line of work, both as a soldier and now as a civilian, he had often been in situations where his decisions had life-altering consequences. But this, stepping into a family's life and protecting a child from harm, it felt different. It felt more personal, more meaningful, in a way he hadn't anticipated. As he entered his quiet home, David found himself haunted by lingering questions about Lily's situation. He thought back to the strained look on Nathan's face when he'd mentioned the custody battle with Lily's mother, the pain and anger hidden behind his otherwise calm demeanor. It was clear that the ordeal wasn't over for them, and he wondered what kind of challenges still lay ahead. For a moment, he considered reaching out to some of his old contacts in law enforcement to see if they could offer any additional support to Nathan and Lily. But he hesitated, knowing that it wasn't his place to interfere any further. He had done what he could, and now it was up to Nathan and the authorities to handle the rest. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility that lingered within him, the quiet resolve that told him he'd step in again if they ever needed him. His phone vibrated, breaking his train of thought. It was a message from Nathan, a simple note of thanks followed by a picture of Lily holding the toy dog David had given her, a wide grin on her face. Beneath the photo was a short message. "She wanted me to tell you she's named him Scout, after our family dog. Thank you again, David. You'll always be a part of our lives." David felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, his heart warming at the sight. He responded with a simple message in return. "I'm glad she's happy. Take care of each other, and let me know if you ever need anything." With a deep sigh, David set his phone down, the quiet of his home suddenly feeling a little more bearable, a little less empty. He knew that his role in Lily's life was likely finished, that she would continue on with her father, facing whatever challenges came next. But he also knew that, in a way, he would always be connected to them, a silent protector if they ever needed him again. Over the next few days, David found himself returning to his normal routine, though the events at the diner lingered in his mind. He continued to think of Lily and Nathan, wondering if they were settling back into a sense of normalcy, if the memory of their ordeal was beginning to fade. He imagined Lily back in school, playing with friends, her laughter echoing in the halls as she moved forward with her life. One morning, about a week after the family gathering, David received a call from an unfamiliar number. He hesitated for a moment before answering, curiosity getting the best of him. "Hello? Mr. Harper?" A woman's voice responded, sounding both professional and slightly hesitant. "Yes, this is David Harper," he replied, his curiosity now fully piqued. "My name is Detective Karen Miles," the woman said, her tone formal but polite. "I'm one of the lead detectives on the case involving Lily Carter and her mother's associates. I hope I'm not disturbing you." David's heartbeat quickened slightly as he recognized the name. The police had mentioned that there would be an ongoing investigation, but he hadn't expected to be contacted personally. "Not at all, Detective. How can I help?" "Well, first of all, I wanted to personally thank you for your intervention," Detective Miles said, a hint of warmth entering her tone. "You were instrumental in preventing what could have been a very tragic outcome. It's rare to see someone step up like that in these situations." David nodded, though she couldn't see him. "Thank you. I'm just glad I could help." Detective Miles hesitated briefly as if weighing her words. "I wanted to give you an update on the case, as you were directly involved. We've been able to piece together more of what happened, and I thought you might want to know the details." David listened intently as she continued, her voice now focused and clear. "Mark Smith, the man who took Lily, was indeed working with her mother, Megan Carter. After an investigation, we discovered documents indicating their plans to take Lily out of the country. They had organized everything from fake IDs to transportation, and it appears they were planning to disappear with her permanently." David felt a chill run down his spine. The enormity of what could have happened if he hadn't intervened settled over him. The knowledge that Lily could have been lost forever to her father and to everyone who cared for her. Megan Carter has been taken into custody as well. Detective Miles continued, her tone somber. "It seems she was the driving force behind the plan, and there's significant evidence to suggest that she was willing to go to any lengths to keep her daughter away from her ex-husband. Given the circumstances, we're moving forward with charges, and will ensure that Lily's safety is prioritized." David took a deep breath, the relief mixing with a sense of disbelief. It was one thing to know that he had prevented something terrible, but hearing the full extent of the plot made it all feel much more real, much more disturbing. "Thank you for letting me know," he said finally, his voice steady. "I can't tell you how much that means. I've been thinking about them ever since that night." Detective Miles's tone softened. "It's clear that you care deeply about what happened, and, while we don't often reach out to civilians in these cases, I felt you deserved to know. You made a difference, Mr. Harper. Not many people would have had the courage to act on their instincts like you did." David felt a warmth in his chest, a quiet pride that he rarely allowed himself to feel. "I appreciate that, Detective. I was just doing what felt right." As the call ended, David found himself lost in thought, the weight of the conversation settling over him. He knew now that he had done more than just protect a child. He had prevented a family from being torn apart and had given Lily and Nathan a chance to move forward without the shadow of fear. And as he looked out his window, watching the first rays of morning light break through the clouds, David felt a profound sense of peace. He had always believed in the importance of protecting others, of standing up when others couldn't. But now, after everything he had experienced, he understood that sometimes the most important battles were the ones fought in silence, with only the quiet certainty that he had made a difference. The following weekend, David received a call from Nathan, who sounded upbeat and hopeful, a stark contrast from the worried father he'd first met in the police station. They spoke briefly, and before hanging up, Nathan invited him over for a casual lunch. David could hear the cheerful laughter of Lily in the background, a welcome sound that made him smile as he accepted the invitation. That Sunday afternoon, David arrived at Nathan's house and was greeted with the same warm hospitality he'd experienced at the family gathering. The scent of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, and Lily appeared in the doorway almost immediately, running up to him with an excited grin. "Mr. David," she called, hugging him tightly. Her energy was contagious, and David felt his heart swell as he returned her hug. "Hey, Lily," he said with a laugh, kneeling down to her level. "How have you been?" "I'm good," she said brightly, showing him the toy dog he had given her. "Scout goes everywhere with me now. He even guards me while I sleep," she added, her face lighting up with a proud smile. David felt a warmth spread through him as he listened to her words, realizing just how resilient she truly was. The trauma of what she had endured was real, yet here she was, healing, smiling, and moving forward. He looked over at Nathan, who was watching them with a grateful smile, his eyes reflecting a quiet pride. The three of them moved to the kitchen, where they spent the next hour enjoying a relaxed meal together, talking and laughing as if they had known each other for years. David found himself surprised by how comfortable he felt and how natural it was to be in their presence. For so long he had distanced himself from forming close connections, content to live in his own quiet world. But being here, with Nathan and Lily, he realized just how much he had missed the warmth and companionship that family could bring. As they finished their meal, Nathan glanced at Lily and nodded. She got up from her seat and ran off, only to return moments later holding a small, wrapped gift in her hands. She handed it to David, her face filled with excitement. "This is for you," she said, her voice shy but filled with pride. "Daddy and I made it together." David accepted the gift, touched by the gesture. Carefully, he unwrapped it to reveal a small, hand-painted wooden plaque with the words, "Thank you, Hero," written in Lily's neat, childlike handwriting. The edges were decorated with little red and blue stars, and at the bottom she had drawn a small heart. David looked at the plaque, his throat tightening with emotion. He traced the words with his finger, feeling the weight of their meaning settle over him. This simple gift, this handmade token of appreciation, held more value to him than any medal or honor he had ever received. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice quiet. This means a lot to me." Lily beamed, her eyes bright as she watched him. "You're welcome, Mr. David," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "You saved me. I wanted to say thank you." Nathan placed a hand on David's shoulder, his expression reflecting the same deep gratitude. "You'll always be part of our family," he said softly. "You didn't just save Lily, you gave us a second chance, a chance to heal, to move forward." David nodded, his heart full as he held the plaque close. "It was an honor," he replied, his voice steady. "And if you ever need anything, anything at all, you know where to find me." They spent the rest of the afternoon together, sharing stories, laughter, and the quiet understanding that they had become more than just acquaintances. They were now bound by an experience that had forever changed them. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, David prepared to leave. Lily hugged him tightly one last time. Her arms wrapped around him with a strength that belied her small frame. "Will you come visit us again?" she asked, her voice hopeful. David smiled, ruffling her hair gently. "You can count on it, Lily," he replied. "I'll come visit as often as you like." Nathan walked David to his car, the two men sharing a final moment of quiet camaraderie. As they shook hands, Nathan's expression grew thoughtful. "You know, David, this whole experience, it's reminded me that there are good people out there," he said, his tone reflective. "People who care, who don't hesitate to help. I'm grateful we crossed paths." David nodded, feeling a similar sense of gratitude. "It goes both ways, Nathan. Meeting you and Lily, it's given me something I didn't know I was missing." They exchanged a final handshake, a wordless promise that their bond would endure, that they would remain in each other's lives. As David drove away, he felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet joy that stayed with him as the miles stretched out before him. In the days that followed, David returned to his daily life, but something had shifted within him. The experience with Lily and Nathan reignited a sense of purpose, a reminder that even in a world filled with challenges and uncertainty, small acts of courage and kindness could create lasting change. He kept the plaque on his mantle, a constant reminder of the lives he had touched, and the lives that had touched his. And whenever he looked at it, he thought of Lily's bright smile, of Nathan's gratitude, and of the quiet bond they had formed. David knew that life would continue to present its challenges, but he was ready to face them, strengthened by the knowledge that he had made a difference, that he had followed his instincts and trusted in the power of compassion. And as he walked through the days that followed, he held on to the simple truth that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism weren't the ones that made headlines or won awards. They were the quiet moments when one person chose to stand up, step forward, and protect a life in need. For David, this experience was a reminder that the smallest actions could have the biggest impact, and that sometimes a single decision could change everything. And as he looked toward the future, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to continue making a difference, one quiet moment at a time. This video tells a powerful story of courage and attentiveness. David, a former Marine, doesn't hesitate to help a young girl in danger despite being on civilian soil, far from the battlefield. When he stops at a small diner, he senses that something is off. A quiet but unsettling fear in Lily's eyes, signals that don't sit right. Trusting his instincts, David uncovers a kidnapping attempt and helps bring Lily safely back to her father. Through this heartfelt story, we're reminded of the power of small acts, compassion, and the importance of trusting our instincts when it comes to protecting those in need. The story reminds us that courage isn't always found in grand gestures. Sometimes, the quietest, most subtle actions make the biggest difference in someone's life. This video is a powerful reminder to look out for those around us, to be ready to help whenever we can, and not to ignore signs of distress. David's story isn't only about kindness and protection. It carries a larger message of responsibility toward our communities, that even small actions can be acts of great humanity. If you found this story meaningful, comment with a 1. If it resonated deeply, comment with a 2. And we'd love to hear your own stories too. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on more inspiring stories like this one. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments below. We can't wait to hear from you.